Picture a mountain fortress carved from living rock, where the wind howls through narrow passes and eagles circle above cliffs that plunge into oblivion. Now imagine 47 women standing at the edge of that precipice, each holding a child. Behind them, an army of thousands closes in, offering slavery as the alternative to surrender. One by one, they begin to dance, a traditional circle dance, singing songs of freedom. And then, still dancing, still singing, they step off the edge into the abyss. This actually happened. The year was 1803, and these weren't the first Souliotes to choose death over submission. They wouldn't be the last. For nearly 3 decades, a population of fewer than 12,000 mountain warriors held off armies 50 times their size. They fought with muskets older than their grandfathers, with powder they made from sulfur scraped from cave walls, with swords reforged from the weapons of their enemies. They fought the most powerful warlord in the Ottoman Empire and refused to bend, even when bending would have saved them. This is the story of the Souliote War, a conflict that Hollywood has never heard of, but that made the Greeks of the 19th century weep with pride and rage. It's a tale of impossible courage and inevitable tragedy, of betrayal and sacrifice, of a people who would rather leap into oblivion than live on their knees. The mountains of Epirus remember. The bones scattered on those cliffs have stories to tell, and today we're going to hear them. To understand the Souliotes, you first need to understand their home, and more importantly, why nobody in their right mind would want to conquer it. Souli wasn't a town in any conventional sense. It was a confederation of 4 nearly inaccessible villages, Souli, Kiapha, Avariko, and Samoniva, perched on a massive mountain formation in the region of Epirus, in what is now northwestern Greece. These weren't villages built on mountains. They were villages that were mountains, carved directly into cliff faces, connected by paths so narrow that 2 men couldn't walk abreast, defended by gorges so deep that falling meant you'd have time to regret your mistakes before you hit bottom. The Souliotes themselves were ethnically Greek, but they were something more than that, or perhaps something different. For generations, they had lived in isolation, developing their own dialect, their own customs, their own fierce culture of independence. They were Christians in a Muslim-dominated empire, mountaineers in a world of plains dwellers, warriors in an age that was slowly, reluctantly, moving towards something resembling civilization. They governed themselves through a democratic assembly where every free man had a voice. Women, remarkably for the era, held significant power in family decisions and were trained in weapons alongside the men. Children learned to shoot before they learned to write. The entire society was organized around a single principle: nobody would ever rule them again. Again is the operative word there, because the Souliotes remembered Ottoman control, remembered taxes and conscription and arbitrary justice. Sometime in the mid-1770s, the exact date is lost to history, wrapped in legend, the Souliotes simply stopped obeying. They stopped paying taxes, they stopped acknowledging Ottoman authority, they declared their mountains free territory. And astonishingly, for a while, the Ottoman Empire let them get away with it. Why? Simple geography and brutal mathematics. The Ottoman Empire in the late 17th century was fighting wars on multiple fronts, against Russia, against Austria, against internal rebellions. Sending an army into the Epirus Mountains to suppress a few thousand stubborn Greeks would cost blood and treasure, and for what? There was no gold in those mountains, no strategic ports, no fertile farmland worth the effort. So an unofficial arrangement emerged. The Souliotes stayed in their mountains, the Ottomans pretended they didn't exist, and everyone went about their business. This uneasy peace might have lasted indefinitely, except for one problem. The mountains that made Souli defensible also made it poor. The terrain was too steep for proper agriculture. There were no natural resources worth mining. The Souliotes survived on goats, gardening, and, this is where things get complicated, robbery. Not to put too fine a point on it, but the Souliotes were raiders. They swept down from their mountains to attack Ottoman caravans, steal livestock from the lowland villages, and generally make life miserable for anyone within striking distance. From their perspective, this was righteous resistance against an occupying power. From the perspective of Ottoman administrators trying to keep trade routes open, the Souliotes were bandits and terrorists who needed to be eliminated. Both perspectives were true. The Souliotes were freedom fighters. They were also, objectively, kind of a menace. This contradiction brings us to the man who would become their nemesis, Ali Pasha of Ioannina, a figure so complex and contradictory that he still defies easy categorization 2 centuries after his death. Ali Pasha was not technically supposed to exist according to the Ottoman system. Born to a family that had been stripped of power and persecuted by the Sultan's government, young Ali survived a childhood that was basically a masterclass in paranoia and ruthlessness. His mother was murdered. His family was scattered. He grew up knowing that the only thing standing between him and a violent death was his willingness to be more violent than his enemies. So, that's what he did. Through a combination of military genius, political cunning, and absolutely breathtaking brutality, Ali clawed his way up the Ottoman hierarchy. By the 1780s, he controlled the Pashalik of Ioannina, essentially the governorship of Epirus, and was busy transforming himself from an Ottoman official into something more like an independent king. Ali's capital at Ioannina became one of the most sophisticated courts in the eastern Mediterranean. He hosted European diplomats and artists. He patronized poets and architects. He modernized his military with French advisors and European weapons. He played the great powers against each other, making deals with France, Britain, Russia, and Austria, while technically remaining an Ottoman vassal. But underneath the cultured exterior was a man of terrifying cruelty. Ali drowned his enemies in the lake outside his palace. He impaled rebels and left them to die slowly as warnings to others. He massacred entire villages that resisted him. When his wife's lover was discovered, Ali had his hands and feet cut off, then his eyes put out, and then kept him alive in a cell for years as a living reminder of the price of betrayal. This is the man who looked at the Souliote Mountains and decided, those are mine now. Ali's motivations were partly strategic. Suli's location gave his warriors control over crucial mountain passes, and partly psychological. Ali Pasha was building a kingdom, and independent peoples within his territory were an intolerable affront to his authority. The Souliotes' defiance was a challenge he couldn't ignore without looking weak. But there was more to it than that. Ali actually had a grudging respect for the Souliotes. He saw them as worthy enemies, as warriors whose courage matched his own. In his mind, conquering them would be both politically necessary and personally satisfying, the ultimate test of his military prowess. So, in 1790, Ali sent ambassadors to Suli with an offer: submit peacefully, pay a nominal tribute, and the Souliotes could keep their autonomy and their way of life. Otherwise, he'd destroy them. The Souliotes' reply came in the form of the ambassadors' bodies, sent back to Ioannina with a message, "Come and take us if you dare." Ali Pasha accepted the challenge. Thus began a war that would last on and off for over 25 years. The first Ottoman assault on Suli in 1790 should have ended the war before it truly began. Ali sent approximately 8,000 troops into the mountains, a force larger than the entire population of Suli, including women, children, and the elderly. The Souliotes could muster perhaps 1,000 fighting men, armed mostly with outdated muskets and homemade ammunition. On paper, it wasn't even a contest. In reality, it was a massacre of the Ottomans. The Souliotes had spent generations preparing for exactly this scenario. Every pass into their territory had been mapped, measured, and turned into a killing ground. They built stone walls across the narrowest sections, creating fortified positions that 5 men could hold against 500. They stockpiled ammunition in hidden caves. They trained every man, woman, and capable child in mountain warfare. Their tactics were brutally simple. Let the enemy come into the mountains, then destroy them piecemeal. Ottoman forces would march into a narrow gorge, their columns stretched out and vulnerable, and suddenly the rocks above them would erupt with musket fire. Before they could respond, the Souliotes would vanish into the terrain like ghosts, retreating to the next prepared position. Ottoman artillery was useless in the narrow passes. Their cavalry couldn't operate on the steep slopes. Their superior numbers meant nothing when they could only attack a handful at a time through terrain where the Souliotes had every advantage. After months of fighting, Ali Pasha withdrew his battered forces. He'd lost thousands of men and gained nothing. The Souliotes had suffered perhaps 100 casualties. It was a humiliation that Ali would not forget. But the Souliotes' victory came with a terrible price they didn't yet understand. They'd made an enemy of the most powerful man in the region, a man with essentially unlimited resources, and, more importantly, unlimited patience. Ali Pasha could lose 1,000 times and keep coming back. The Souliotes could only lose once. For the next several years, an uneasy peace held. Ali was busy with other wars, other rebellions, other problems. The Souliotes used the time to fortify their positions, train their warriors, and, fatally, grow overconfident. They began raiding more aggressively, striking deeper into Ali's territory. They took contracts as mercenaries for Ali's enemies, fighting in various local conflicts across Epirus. They were building a reputation as invincible mountain warriors, and that reputation was becoming a problem. Other subject peoples were looking at Souliot and thinking, if they can resist, maybe we can too. Ali Pasha couldn't allow that. But he'd learned his lesson from the first campaign. This time, he wouldn't attack with brute force. He'd use strategy, psychology, and something the Souliotes had never faced before: patient, methodical, total war. When Ali Pasha renewed his campaign against Souliot in 1800, it looked different from the start. Instead of sending armies crashing into the mountains, he began by targeting everything around them. He burned the lowland villages that traded with Souliot. He cut off their supply routes. He offered massive bounties for any Souliote captured alive, or for their heads if alive wasn't possible. He built a network of fortresses around the Souliote territory, not to attack them directly, but to strangle them slowly. Most devastatingly, he began negotiating with individual Souliote clans, offering gold and promises of position in his court. The unity that had made Souliot strong began to fracture. Some families argued for negotiation. Others insisted on resistance to the death. What had been a unified community began to splinter into factions. Ali also demonstrated his new strategy through terror. When he captured Souliote raiders, he didn't simply execute them. He tortured them publicly, slowly, where refugees and messengers would see and carry word back to the mountains. He wanted the Souliotes to know that surrender was an option, but defeat would be unbearable. Despite this psychological pressure, the military situation initially favored Souliot. In 1800 and 1801, Ottoman forces repeatedly tried to penetrate the Souliote defenses and were repeatedly thrown back. At the Battle of Kiafa in 1801, approximately 200 Souliotes held off an Ottoman force estimated at 5,000 for 3 days, inflicting catastrophic casualties before retreating in good order. But then came betrayal. A Souliote chieftain named Botsaris, the exact first name varies in different accounts, made a deal with Ali Pasha. In exchange for gold and position, he opened a mountain pass that had previously been considered impregnable. Overnight, the strategic situation reversed. Ottoman forces poured through the pass into the heart of Souliote territory. The Souliotes fought desperately to contain the breach. At Zalongo, Souliote warriors and the women fighting alongside them held a critical position for 2 days against overwhelming odds. When ammunition ran out, they fought with swords and rocks. When they were finally overrun, the survivors retreated to higher ground, carrying their wounded and still fighting. By December 1803, the situation was hopeless. The Souliote Confederation was fractured, their fortifications were breached, their ammunition was running low, disease and starvation were spreading through the overcrowded villages, and still Ali's armies came, wave after wave, never stopping, never giving up. The Souliote leaders faced an impossible choice: surrender and hope for mercy from a man famous for his cruelty, or fight to the last and ensure the annihilation of their entire people. Different clans chose different paths. Some negotiated terms of surrender. Others decided to flee, trying to break through Ottoman lines to reach the coast and escape by sea. A few chose to stay and fight until the end. But it was a group of 60 women and children, trapped on the mountain of Zalongo with no escape route, who would create the moment that defined the Souliote War forever. The details of what happened on Zalongo vary in different accounts. Some say there were 47 women, some say more than 60. Some accounts say they were accompanied by children, others say they'd already sent the children away, though to where and how is never explained. What every account agrees is this. Surrounded by Ottoman forces with no hope of escape or rescue, facing the certainty of slavery or death, these women made a choice. They gathered at the edge of a cliff, and they began to dance. The dance was a traditional circle dance, a Souliotes, the kind of dance they danced at weddings and festivals, the kind that celebrated life and community. They held hands, they moved in the ancient patterns, and they sang. Different sources preserve different lyrics, but the meaning is always the same. Freedom or death. Better the grave than slavery. They sang about their mountains, their homes, their dead husbands and sons. They sang defiance. And then, one by one, they stepped off the cliff. Some accounts say they threw their children over first to spare them from watching. Others say mothers and children jumped together. One version claims the women passed around a single infant, each kissing the child before jumping, until the last woman threw the baby over and followed. Ottoman soldiers watching from below reportedly stood in stunned silence. Even Ali Pasha's most hardened warriors, men who'd committed atrocities throughout the region, were shaken by what they witnessed. This wasn't a military defeat. This was something else entirely. A repudiation so absolute, a defiance so complete that it transcended mere resistance. The women of Zalongo chose to dance off a cliff rather than submit to Ali Pasha. They transformed their own destruction into an act of ultimate agency. They denied Ali his victory, even in defeat. But Zalongo wasn't the end of the Souliote War. It was the beginning of the end, but the dying would take years more.
After Zalongo, after the fall of the main Souliote strongholds, approximately 3,000 to 4,000 Souliotes managed to break through Ottoman lines and reach the coast. They fled to the Ionian Islands, particularly Corfu, which was under French control at the time. Later, as control of the islands shifted, they'd move again, some to Russian-controlled zones, others to areas under British protection. Ali Pasha had conquered their territory, but he hadn't broken their spirit. The Souliotes in exile formed military units, hiring themselves out as mercenaries to whoever would pay them, and more importantly, to whoever was fighting the Ottomans. They fought for the French, for the Russians, for the British. They became a diaspora of professional warriors, carrying their mountain warfare expertise across the Mediterranean. Ali Pasha, meanwhile, had won his war, but lost something in the process. The brutal campaign against Souli had damaged his reputation, even among his Ottoman peers. The cost in men and resources had been staggering. By some estimates, Ali lost more than 20,000 soldiers over the course of the various Souliote campaigns. For what? For mountains that produced nothing of value? For villages that were now depopulated ruins? In 1820, Ali made a crucial miscalculation. Feeling himself strong enough to break free from Ottoman control entirely, he rebelled against Sultan Mahmud II. It was, in retrospect, a catastrophically bad decision. The same European powers he'd played against each other for decades now had no reason to support him. The Ottoman Empire, freshly alarmed by Greek independence movements, could no longer tolerate his ambitions. And the Souliotes? The Souliotes came home. When the Ottoman Empire turned against Ali Pasha in 1820, the Souliotes saw their chance. The Sultan's forces offered them the one thing they wanted most, the opportunity to return to their mountains and fight Ali Pasha again. Approximately 1,500 Souliote warriors joined the Ottoman campaign against Ali. The irony was not lost on anyone. These Greek Christians were now fighting alongside the Muslim empire that had oppressed their people, against the Muslim warlord who had destroyed their homeland. But to the Souliotes, this wasn't about religion or politics. This was personal. The siege of Ioannina lasted months. Ali Pasha, now an old man in his 80s, fought with the same ferocity he'd shown his entire life. He turned his palace into a fortress. He mined the lake. He armed everyone down to the servants. When Ottoman forces finally breached his defenses in January 1822, Ali retreated to a small island fortress in the middle of the lake. On January 24, 1822, Ottoman soldiers stormed Ali's final refuge. They found the old lion of Ioannina sitting calmly, reading the Quran. He knew what was coming. The soldiers shot him, then beheaded him. His head was sent to Constantinople as proof of death and warning to other would-be rebels. The Souliotes were there when it happened. Some accounts claim Souliote warriors were among those who stormed the fortress. Whether they personally killed Ali Pasha is uncertain, but they were present for his end, and that was revenge enough. With Ali dead and his domain collapsed, you might think the Souliote story would end with return and restoration. It didn't. It couldn't. Because by 1822, Greece was in the midst of a much larger war, the Greek War of Independence, and the Souliotes were about to play a crucial role in a conflict that would reshape the entire region. Act 8. The Souliotes and the Greek Revolution. The Greek War of Independence began in 1821, and the Souliotes threw themselves into it with the same ferocity they'd shown against Ali Pasha. They had experience, training, and most importantly, a reputation that made them feared across the region. Souliote leaders like Marcos Botzaris, from the same Botzaris clan that had produced the traitor years earlier, a redemption arc if there ever was one, became legendary figures in the independence struggle. Marcos Botzaris led Souliote units in critical battles, using the same mountain warfare tactics that had held off Ali's armies decades earlier. In August 1823, at the Battle of Karpanisi, Botzaris led 350 Souliote warriors in a night attack against an Ottoman army of over 10,000. It was suicide mission mathematics, but the Souliotes specialized in impossible odds. They struck at midnight, infiltrated the Ottoman camp, and caused chaos out of all proportion to their numbers. Botzaris himself was killed in the fighting, shot through the head. But his raid delayed the Ottoman advance long enough for Greek forces to regroup. The Souliotes fought throughout the War of Independence with distinction and suffered catastrophic casualties. They were always placed in the most dangerous positions, always given the missions nobody else would take, always expected to hold against impossible odds because they'd done it before. By the time Greece finally won independence in 1832, backed by British, French, and Russian intervention, the Souliote population had been devastated. Of the roughly 12,000 Souliotes who'd lived in the mountains before Ali's campaigns, perhaps 3,000 survived to see independent Greece. An entire culture had been ground down to a remnant. The new Greek government, grateful for Souliote's sacrifice but unsure what to do with warrior clans in peacetime, granted the survivors lands in the Peloponnese in central Greece. Some accepted and tried to build new lives. Others remained in exile, scattered across the Mediterranean. A few returned to their original mountains, trying to rebuild the villages that Ali had burned decades earlier. But the Souli they returned to was not the Souli they'd left. The villages were ruins. The paths were overgrown. The people who'd made it a living culture were dead or scattered. You can't rebuild a civilization from memory alone. Today, if you travel to the mountains of Epirus, you can still find the ruins of Souliote villages. The stone walls remain, slowly crumbling but still standing, testament to the people who'd rather die than surrender. At Salongo, there's a monument now, a sculpture of dancing women eternally frozen at the moment before they jumped, a reminder of what happened on that cliff. The dance of Salongo became one of the most powerful symbols in Greek culture. Poets wrote about it. Painters immortalized it. Every Greek schoolchild learns the story. It represents something primal about Greek identity. The willingness to choose death over subjugation. The preference for freedom over survival. But monuments and legends don't tell you what it actually meant to be there. They don't explain the desperation that would drive mothers to throw their children off a cliff. They don't explain the calculation that made death preferable to life. They don't capture the sound of women singing as they danced toward oblivion. The Souliote War was ultimately a losing battle. Ali Pasha won, militarily speaking. He conquered their territory, destroyed their society, scattered their people. By any conventional measure, the Souliotes lost. But Ali's victory was Pyrrhic. The cost of defeating Suli weakened him enough that when he overreached, he fell. The Souliote diaspora kept their culture alive through exile and eventually came home. And the legend of their resistance inspired the larger Greek revolution that finally threw off Ottoman control. More than that, the Souliotes denied Ali the one thing he actually wanted: submission. He could kill them, but he couldn't make them kneel. He could destroy their villages, but he couldn't break their spirit. The women of Zouliote chose to dance off a cliff specifically to deny him the satisfaction of their surrender. In that sense, the Souliotes won after all, not militarily, but metaphysically. They kept their freedom even in death. They maintained their dignity even in defeat. They made sure that 200 years later, we remember them not as victims, but as warriors who wouldn't bend.
There's a Greek word, philotimo, that doesn't translate cleanly into English. It means something like honor, but deeper. Pride, but not arrogance. The sense of doing right by your family, your community, your principles, regardless of cost. The Souliotes embodied philotimo to an almost pathological degree. They could have negotiated. They could have surrendered on favorable terms and kept their lives. Ali Pasha offered them deals throughout the conflict: autonomy in exchange for nominal submission, relocation to better lands, positions in his court. He didn't particularly want to exterminate them. He just wanted them to acknowledge his authority. The Souliotes refused, because to accept would have been to betray everything they were. They'd built a society based on the principle that free people governed themselves. To surrender that principle for survival would have meant they were no longer Souliotes, just Greeks who happened to live in mountains. So they fought a war they knew they'd probably lose. They died in numbers that would destroy their society. Women danced off cliffs, holding their children. And somehow, through that absolute refusal to compromise, they achieved a kind of immortality. Today, Greeks across the world know the Souliote story. They sing the songs. They dance the dances. They tell their children about the mountain warriors who wouldn't bow and the women who preferred death to slavery. The Souliotes failed to save their villages, but they succeeded in saving their soul. And in doing so, they gave the Greek people a story to rally around when their own war of independence came. The mountains of Epirus are still there. The cliffs of Zouliote still drop into the same abyss. The ruins of Souliote villages still dot the landscape, slowly being reclaimed by the forests. The bones of the fallen are still there too, scattered across the slopes, marking the places where 12,000 people chose to die free rather than live as slaves. Every year, Greek pilgrims climb to Zouliote to honor the women who danced. They sing the songs. They sometimes dance themselves, though never too close to the edge. They remember. Because some stories need to be remembered. Some sacrifices demand witnesses. Some courage is too absolute to let fade into history. The Souliotes lost their war, but they won their immortality.
And in the end, they got the last laugh. Ali Pasha died with a Souliote sword possibly at his throat, or at least Souliote warriors nearby. The Ottoman Empire that supported him collapsed. The Greeks won their independence. And the Souliotes? They're still here, in the stories, in the songs, in the eternal dance frozen in stone above that cliff. They promised they'd rather die than submit. They kept that promise. And 2 centuries later, we're still talking about them. Still in awe of that impossible courage. Still trying to understand what would drive an entire people to make that choice. The Souliote War lasted from 1790 to 1803, with aftershocks continuing through the 1820s. Fewer than 12,000 people were involved at most. No major powers cared at the time, no grand strategies hung in the balance. No treaties mentioned them, no kings' thrones depended on the outcome. And yet, their story endures, passed down through generations, because it speaks to something fundamental about human dignity. There are worse things than dying. There are costs too high to pay. There are principles worth dying for. The Souliotes knew this. They lived it. They died proving it. And the mountains remember.